Hey, are you still awake? I hope today wasn't too exhausting. Maybe work refused to end. Maybe your to-do list somehow got longer instead of shorter. Or maybe your brain simply decided that 2 in the morning was the perfect time to replay every awkward conversation you've had since elementary school. If that's the case, you're in good company. Humans have always found wonderfully creative ways to worry about things. The people we're visiting tonight were no exception. So do me one small favor. Let your shoulders sink a little. Unclench your jaw. Unclench your jaw. Take one slow breath. Tonight, instead of thinking about tomorrow, we're going to spend some time with the people who handled the jobs nobody else wanted in medieval Europe. And by handled, I mean quite literally, in some cases. As strange as modern life can feel, at least very few of us wake up wondering whether our career involves climbing into a giant pit full of other people's toilet waste before sunrise. History usually loves kings, queens, fearless knights, and brilliant inventors. It has a remarkable talent for pretending civilization somehow maintained itself through sheer optimism, while everyone important posed dramatically in expensive clothing. But every medieval town rested upon the backs of people whose names rarely appeared in chronicles. They were not celebrated in songs. They were rarely painted in beautiful manuscript. Nobody commissioned a magnificent stained glass window honoring the fellow who spent 12 hours removing dead horses from the roadside. And yet, if these forgotten workers disappeared for only a few weeks, the entire town would have descended into spectacular chaos. The first thing to understand about a medieval town is that it possessed an astonishing ability to produce waste. Humans have always excelled at creating leftovers, smells, and problems that immediately become someone else's responsibility. Medieval people simply did it with fewer drains and significantly more livestock wandering wherever they pleased. Imagine waking before dawn in a town of perhaps 3,000 people. The streets are narrow, muddy, uneven, and already alive with noise. Chickens inspect puddles with professional seriousness. Dogs negotiate ownership of suspicious scraps. Pigs roam with the confidence of local politicians who know no one is willing to challenge them. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys because nearly every household burns wood or peat. The air smells of damp earth, ash, stale beer, wet wool, horse sweat, and breakfast beginning to cook. Surprisingly, this is one of the better smells the town will produce today. Now imagine trying to keep this place clean. Actually, don't imagine too hard. The medieval townspeople generally didn't. Instead, they hired, or perhaps more accurately, tolerated, certain individuals whose entire existence revolved around cleaning up disasters nobody wished to acknowledge. Among these unsung professionals stood the gong farmer. Despite the cheerful sound of the name, no bells were involved. A gong, in medieval English, referred to human waste collected inside cesspits beneath privies. A gong farmer's responsibility was to remove it. Yes, by hand. Well, with shovels, buckets, ropes, barrels, and an optimism that deserves far greater historical recognition. Interestingly, this unpleasant occupation often took place at night, not because the workers particularly enjoyed moonlit scenery, but because transporting enormous barrels of human waste through crowded streets during daylight tended to reduce everyone's appetite. Night offered cooler temperatures, quieter roads, and fewer horrified witnesses pretending they had never personally contributed to the contents of those pits. The work itself required remarkable courage. Many medieval cesspits were astonishingly deep. Some reached 10 or 15 feet underground. The gong farmer would descend using ladders into spaces where oxygen was scarce. Toxic gases collected silently, and the walls might suddenly collapse after years of absorbing moisture. Modern historians occasionally discover official records describing workers who simply never climbed back out. The danger was invisible. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide. Nobody knew their scientific names. People simply knew that sometimes a perfectly healthy man entered a pit and quietly died. The explanation varied: bad air, cursed vapors, divine punishment, an unfortunate Tuesday. Whatever people believed, the outcome remained exactly the same. Yet someone always accepted the job, usually because the pay was surprisingly decent. This is one of history's recurring little jokes. The dirtiest jobs often paid relatively well, because almost everyone preferred doing literally anything else. The gong farmer occupied a strange social position. He might earn respectable wages. He might own property. He might feed his family comfortably. Yet neighbors often avoided him socially. Money, it turned out, could purchase bread more easily than dinner invitations. One can almost picture medieval parents whispering to their children, "He's a respectable man." Pause. But perhaps wave from over there. Ironically, cleanliness itself depended entirely upon people considered permanently unclean. Civilization has always enjoyed this particular contradiction. Once the barrels were full, they had to be transported beyond the town walls. There, the waste sometimes became fertilizer for surrounding farmland. Nothing was wasted if it could possibly become useful. Even the least glamorous substances eventually returned to support another harvest. History occasionally resembles an enormous recycling project with surprisingly poor marketing. Of course, human waste represented only one category of medieval inconvenience. Animals created another. Horses powered transportation. Oxen pulled carts. Cows supplied milk. Pigs wandered wherever pigs considered appropriate, which usually included places everyone else wished they wouldn't. Eventually, every animal died. And dead animals presented urgent problems. A horse weighs hundreds of kilograms. Once dead, it becomes less of a majestic companion and more of an extremely large biological deadline. Enter another forgotten profession, the knacker. The knacker specialized in removing dead animals from roads, farms, marketplaces, and city outskirts before decay transformed inconvenience into catastrophe. Imagine receiving that morning's assignment. Good news, pause. There's only one dead horse today. Somehow this counted as encouraging. The work demanded enormous physical strength. Dead animals could not simply be nudged politely aside. Teams of workers hauled carcasses using ropes, carts, hooks, and determined expressions that probably disappeared forever by lunchtime. Outside town limits, the carcasses might be stripped for anything useful. Hides, bones, fat, hooves. Even in death, animals continued contributing to medieval industry. Bones became tools, fat became candles, hide entered tanning workshops. Very little escaped practical use. Efficiency sometimes develops not from environmental consciousness, but from poverty. When resources are scarce, creativity becomes mandatory. Of course, removing decomposing bodies meant enduring smells that defy comfortable description. Modern visitors occasionally complain about overflowing garbage bins after a summer weekend. A medieval knacker would probably smile sympathetically before returning to drag away a horse that had spent 4 warm days expanding gently beneath the afternoon sun. Perspective is everything. Society needed these workers desperate, yet their occupations carried social stigma. People often associated death, decay, and unpleasant odors with moral impurity. It made very little logical sense. Nobody blamed the doctor for meeting sick patients. Well, actually, sometimes they did. History was generous with misplaced blame. Still, knackers frequently lived near the edges of settlements, partly because their work occurred there, partly because nobody wanted rendering yards next to bakeries. This was probably one medieval zoning decision everyone agreed upon. Then there were the tanners. If medieval Europe had organized a competition for the strongest unpleasant smell, tanning leather would have qualified comfortably for the finals. Leather surrounded everyday life: shoes, belts, scabbards, harnesses, book covers, harnesses, gloves, armor straps. Countless ordinary objects depended upon leather, but transforming animal skin into durable leather proved astonishingly unpleasant. Fresh hides arrived covered with blood, fat, hair, and scraps of flesh. First, they required soaking, then scraping, then soaking again. Hair had to disappear, residual tissue needed removal. Various chemical treatments followed. Some regions relied upon lime. Others employed mixtures containing animal brains. And perhaps, most famously, urine. Yes, large quantities of urine. Entire industries quietly depended upon the willingness of ordinary people to collect yesterday's chamber pot and sell its contents. Human urine contains ammonia. Ammonia softens hides. Chemically speaking, it works remarkably well. Socially speaking, it ensures nobody mistakes your workshop for a perfume boutique. The smell surrounded tanneries constantly. Travelers often identified towns by odor before seeing the walls themselves. Oh. Pause. We must be getting close. How can you tell? My eyes have started watering. Tanneries usually stood downstream from populated areas. Again, not because tanners lacked importance, because everyone preferred drinking water that had not recently participated in industrial leather production. Strangely enough, successful tanners could become quite prosperous. Leather remained essential. Demand stayed high. Good craftsmanship commanded respect. People admired the finished boots while politely ignoring the extraordinary journey those boots had taken to reach their feet. Human psychology has always preferred attractive endings to uncomfortable beginnings, and that preference, as we will discover, shaped nearly every hidden profession that kept medieval society alive. The strange thing about medieval society was that everyone depended upon these unpleasant occupations, while pretending they hardly existed. It was a bit like a stage play in which the audience applauds the actors, but never wonders who built the scenery, swept the floor, or extinguished the candles afterward. Civilization has always been surprisingly good at overlooking the people who prevent it from collapsing into an extremely smelly disaster. If there was one profession that embodied this contradiction more than almost any other, it was the executioner. Now, this is where modern imagination usually becomes rather dramatic. Films tend to present executioners as towering villains with permanent scowls and muscles carved from granite, standing around sharpening axes, while thunder conveniently rumbles in the background. Medieval reality, as usual, was both stranger and far more awkward. An executioner was not simply someone who carried out punishments. In many towns, he occupied one of the most isolated social positions imaginable. Ironically, he worked directly for the authorities, yet ordinary citizens often treated him almost like an untouchable outsider. Think about that for a moment. The local government hired him. The courts relied upon him. The law could not function without him. Yet after work, very few people wanted to share a drink with him. It is one of history's more uncomfortable examples of collective hypocrisy. Someone had to enforce justice, at least according to the standards of the time, but nobody wanted to be reminded that justice occasionally required a human being to perform deeply unpleasant tasks. The executioner's responsibilities extended far beyond carrying an axe. He might supervise public punishments. He might oversee torture during criminal investigations, depending on the region and the period. He often disposed of bodies that respectable citizens preferred not to touch. Sometimes he removed stray dogs from the streets. Sometimes he cleaned places associated with executions. Occasionally he even acted as a kind of surgeon. Oddly enough, this last responsibility surprises many people. Why would an executioner practice medicine? The answer is wonderfully medieval. Because he understood anatomy, not through university lectures or carefully illustrated textbooks, but through practical experience that nobody particularly envied. Some executioners became surprisingly skilled at setting broken bones, treating wounds, or preparing herbal remedies. Official physicians occasionally looked down upon them while quietly admitting that the man everyone avoided possessed rather impressive practical knowledge. History loves these little contradictions. Status and competence have never been guaranteed companions. Children sometimes feared the executioner before they ever saw him. Parents might warn misbehaving youngsters that terrible consequences awaited anyone who ignored the law. Entire reputations developed from whispers rather than personal encounters. Imagine walking through the market every morning, knowing that half the crowd recognized your face, while simultaneously hoping you would continue existing somewhere very far away. It must have produced an unusual kind of loneliness. Some towns even required executioners to live outside ordinary neighborhoods. Marriage became difficult. Many respectable families refused to allow their daughters anywhere near such households. As a result, executioners often married within a very small circle of families who shared similar occupations. Generation after generation, certain professions remained trapped inside their own social worlds, not because of lack of ability, not because of lack of wealth, simply because everyone else decided they smelled vaguely of bad luck. Humans have always demonstrated remarkable creativity when inventing invisible walls. Ironically, many executioners enjoyed financial stability. The work paid well. Additional income came from selling the clothing or possessions of executed criminals, where local laws permitted. Sometimes they collected fees for animal disposal or medical services. Financial success, however, rarely translated into popularity. One suspects that no amount of money could overcome the conversation-ending sentence. So, what do you do for a living? Meanwhile, another group of workers faced danger of an entirely different variety. Gravediggers. Modern cemeteries often appear peaceful. Trees sway gently. Birds sing. Stone markers weather quietly beneath changing seasons. Medieval burial grounds, especially during epidemics, could become scenes of relentless labor. Disease visited medieval Europe with depressing regularity. Plague receives most of the attention, naturally, but outbreaks of dysentery, smallpox, influenza, typhus, and countless other illnesses repeatedly swept through towns. Every epidemic transformed burial into urgent public necessity. Gravediggers rarely enjoyed the luxury of working slowly. Fresh graves appeared day after day, sometimes hour after hour. The physical labor alone proved exhausting. Digging through dense earth using medieval tools demanded extraordinary endurance. Rain complicated everything. Frozen ground became almost impossible. Summer heat accelerated decomposition. Every season found its own inventive way of making difficult work even harder. And hovering over every task remained the invisible fear of illness. People did not understand bacteria. They knew nothing of viruses. They observed patterns. Someone became sick. Someone died. Another person who handled the body later became ill. The exact mechanism remained mysterious. Naturally, explanations varied wildly. Bad smells, poisoned air, invisible corruption. Oddly enough, despite misunderstanding disease, some practical habits accidentally reduced risk. Workers occasionally covered their faces. They burned fragrant herbs. They washed tools. Not because microbes had been discovered, but because experience whispered that certain routines seemed helpful. Human beings often stumble toward useful knowledge long before understanding why it works. That quiet process repeats throughout history again and again. Gravediggers developed emotional resilience almost out of necessity. Imagine spending every working day confronting mortality, not as an abstract philosophical concept discussed beside a warm fireplace, as heavy physical reality. A child, an elderly grandmother, a merchant, a monk, a soldier. Every grave reminded them that wealth, beauty, influence, and ambition eventually reached exactly the same destination. Perhaps this explains why medieval literature speaks so often about death as life's great equalizer. For some workers, equality was not poetry. Many respectable families refused to allow their daughters anywhere near such households. As a result, executioners often married within a very small circle of families who shared similar occupations. Generation after generation, certain professions remained trapped inside their own social worlds, not because of lack of ability, not because of lack of wealth, simply because everyone else decided they smelled vaguely of bad luck. Humans have always demonstrated remarkable creativity when inventing invisible walls. Ironically, many executioners enjoyed financial stability. The work paid well. Additional income came from selling the clothing or possessions of executed criminals where local laws permitted. Sometimes they collected fees for animal disposal or medical services. Financial success, however, rarely translated into popularity. One suspects that no amount of money could overcome the conversation-ending sentence. So, what do you do for a living? Meanwhile, another group of workers faced danger of an entirely different variety. Gravediggers. Modern cemeteries often appear peaceful. Trees sway gently. Birds sing. Stone markers weather quietly beneath changing seasons. Medieval burial grounds, especially during epidemics, could become scenes of relentless labor. Disease visited medieval Europe with depressing regularity. Plague receives most of the attention, naturally, but outbreaks of dysentery, smallpox, influenza, typhus, and countless other illnesses repeatedly swept through towns. Every epidemic transformed burial into urgent public necessity. Gravediggers rarely enjoyed the luxury of working slowly. Fresh graves appeared day after day. sometimes hour after hour. The physical labor alone proved exhausting. Digging through dense earth using medieval tools demanded extraordinary endurance. Rain complicated everything. Frozen ground became almost impossible. Summer heat accelerated decomposition. Every season found its own inventive way of making difficult work even harder. And hovering over every task remained the invisible fear of illness. People did not understand bacteria. They knew nothing of viruses. They observed patterns. Someone became sick. Someone died. Another person who handled the body later became ill. The exact mechanism remained mysterious. Naturally, explanations varied wildly. Bad smells, poisoned air, invisible corruption. Oddly enough, despite misunderstanding disease, some practical habits accidentally reduced risk. Workers occasionally covered their faces. They burned fragrant herbs. They washed tools, not because microbes had been discovered, but because experience whispered that certain routines seemed helpful. Human beings often stumble toward useful knowledge long before understanding why it works. That quiet process repeats throughout history again and again. Gravediggers developed emotional resilience almost out of necessity. Imagine spending every working day confronting mortality, not as an abstract philosophical concept discussed beside a warm fireplace, as heavy physical reality. A child, an elderly grandmother, a merchant, a monk, a soldier. Every grave reminded them that wealth, beauty, influence, and ambition eventually reached exactly the same destination. Perhaps this explains why medieval literature speaks so often about death as life's great equalizer. For some workers, equality was not poetry. The more closely we examine these forgotten occupations, the more one peculiar truth begins to emerge. Medieval society loved to divide people into neat categories of honorable and dishonorable, respectable and shameful, clean and unclean. Reality, meanwhile, seemed determined to ignore those categories completely. The baker needed the tanner. The nobleman depended on the gravedigger. The bishop relied on the gong farmer, although one imagines he preferred not to think about the details immediately before Sunday morning prayers. It was an elaborate social performance in which everyone quietly agreed not to acknowledge the people making daily life possible. Perhaps nowhere was this contradiction more obvious than in the world of butchers. Now, at first glance, being a butcher might sound perfectly respectable. After all, medieval Europeans ate enormous quantities of meat whenever they could afford it. Every feast, every market day, every noble banquet depended on someone preparing animals for the table. But the actual work was considerably less elegant than the roasted goose, eventually appearing on polished wooden platters. The medieval butcher usually began work long before sunrise. The streets remained damp with dew, while the air still carried a surprising freshness before the market fully awakened. Animals arrived alive, cattle reluctant to cooperate, sheep surprisingly stubborn despite appearances, pigs loudly announcing their opinions to absolutely everyone nearby. If you have ever tried persuading a large animal to walk exactly where you want it to go, you already understand that medieval butchers required remarkable patience in addition to physical strength, and patience, unfortunately, was rarely included in artistic paintings of cheerful marketplaces. The work itself demanded precision. A poorly handled animal represented wasted food. A careless cut damaged valuable meat. An inexperienced worker could ruin hides destined for the tannery. Nothing could be squandered, not because medieval people possessed unusually advanced environmental awareness, but because replacing lost resources proved painfully expensive. Almost every part of an animal found another purpose. Bones became tools, horn became cups and combs, fat turned into candles and soap, intestines became strings, cords, or sausage casings. Blood even found culinary uses in certain regions. Modern supermarkets have quietly hidden this astonishing efficiency behind neat plastic packaging. The medieval butcher witnessed the entire journey. Because of this constant contact with blood and animal remains, butchers occupied another curious social position. People respected their importance. They also preferred not to stand downwind. Entire sections of medieval towns gradually became associated with particular industries. Butchers often worked together near streams where water could carry away certain unavoidable consequences. Again, Medieval urban planning occasionally displayed flashes of practical brilliance. Not always, but occasionally. Interestingly, many medieval laws devoted remarkable attention to butchers. Inspectors examined meat, authorities regulated prices. Certain animals could not be sold if they died from disease rather than healthy slaughter. Rules multiplied because food affected everyone. A dishonest butcher endangered entire communities. One begins noticing a fascinating pattern. The dirtiest professions often attracted the greatest legal attention, not because lawmakers enjoyed reading about unpleasant subjects, because mistakes carried enormous consequences. A dishonest merchant might cheat one customer. A careless butcher might sicken hundreds. Then there were the fullers. Now, here is a profession almost guaranteed to surprise modern listeners. Imagine spending your entire career washing cloth. Sounds harmless enough, until you discover the preferred cleaning ingredient: human urine, again. History appears remarkably committed to recycling this particular substance. Freshly woven wool contained oils, grease, dirt, and natural residues. Ordinary water accomplished very little. Urine, however, contained ammonia. Once again, chemistry quietly solved problems centuries before people understood chemistry itself. Entire workshops collected urine from households. People actually stored it, sold it, transported it. Imagine explaining that business model during a modern job interview. So, what exactly does your company specialize in? We prefer to think of ourselves as liquid textile consultants. The fuller then stamped, pounded, soaked, and scrubbed enormous quantities of fabric. Sometimes workers literally walked upon cloth inside vats for hours, step after step, after endless step. One almost imagines medieval exercise instructors taking notes. By the end of the day, exhausted workers had transformed rough fabric into softer, cleaner textiles ready for clothing. Customers admired the finished garments. Very few wished to discuss the manufacturing process. Civilization has always depended upon selective curiosity. Speaking of clothing, medieval laundresses deserve their own quiet admiration. Laundry today generally involves pressing a few buttons and pretending not to notice how quickly clean clothes become dirty again. Medieval laundry resembled an athletic competition. Water required carrying. Soap remained expensive. Water required carrying. Soap remained expensive. Stains fought stubbornly. Heavy wool absorbed astonishing amounts of moisture. Large families produced mountains of clothing. Washing days consumed entire daylight hours. Women often knelt beside rivers regardless of season. Winter transformed ordinary chores into endurance tests. Cold water numbed fingers. Wind stiffened wet fabric. Sheets froze. Yet somehow clean clothing emerged. There is something quietly heroic about that. No royal chronicler eagerly recorded the woman who washed 40 shirts beside an icy stream. Yet her work mattered every bit as much as another minor border dispute between neighboring nobles. History occasionally rewards dramatic speeches while overlooking extraordinary perseverance. Then there were the lime burners. These workers rarely appear in popular documentaries, despite supplying one of civilization's essential building materials. Limestone entered enormous kilns. Intense fires burned continuously for days. Heat transformed stone into quicklime. Useful? Absolutely. Dangerous? Profoundly. Quicklime reacts violently with water. Dust irritated eyes and lungs. Burns occurred regularly. Workers labored beside furnaces so hot that simply approaching them became exhausting. The irony, of course, is delightful in its own strange way. People risked their health manufacturing materials, later used to construct magnificent cathedrals, celebrating eternal salvation. The buildings remain. The workers usually vanish from memory. Perhaps history itself possesses a slight architectural bias. And then we meet one of medieval Europe's least celebrated experts, the collector of stray animals. Dogs wandered. Pigs escaped. Goats demonstrated their timeless commitment to ignoring instructions. Someone had to retrieve these determined fugitives before they destroyed gardens, frightened children, or wandered directly into market stalls displaying expensive produce. One suspects medieval goats possessed personalities remarkably similar to modern goats, which is another way of saying they considered human plans mildly amusing suggestions. These animal catchers required surprising skill. Running wildly after pigs generally resulted in the pig discovering entirely new directions. Experienced workers understood behavior. Patience often succeeded where speed failed. History quietly reminds us that understanding proves more useful than force, surprisingly often. Now, throughout all these occupations, one emotional thread connected nearly everyone: smell. It sounds almost comical today, yet odor shaped medieval life more profoundly than most people realize. Without modern sanitation, deodorants, detergents, sewage systems, refrigeration, or indoor plumbing, smells became constant companion. People identified neighborhoods through scent. Visitors recognized industries before seeing workshops. Clothing absorbed smoke, sweat, leather, livestock, cooking fires, damp straw, herbs, and human labor. Perfume existed certainly, mostly for the wealthy. And even then, perfume rarely replaced unpleasant smells. It simply negotiated temporary peace treaties with them. One medieval nobleman could easily smell of expensive rose oil layered confidently over horse travel, fireplace smoke, heavy wool, and several enthusiastic hunting dogs. Throughout all of this, people adapted. That may be the most astonishing lesson hidden beneath every unpleasant profession. What initially seems unbearable gradually becomes ordinary. The gong farmer stopped noticing certain odors. The tanner became accustomed to chemical fumes. The gravedigger learned to work calmly beside mortality. Not because conditions improved, because human beings possess an extraordinary ability to normalize almost anything. That talent has allowed civilizations to survive. It has also occasionally encouraged them to postpone solving obvious problems for several centuries, which, if we're being completely honest, is a habit humanity has never entirely abandoned. As the sun began to sink behind the rooftops of a medieval town, another quiet transformation took place. Merchants packed away their goods. Blacksmiths allowed their forges to cool. Bakers counted the loaves that remained. Children, who had somehow found enough energy to race through muddy streets for an entire day, reluctantly drifted back toward home. But for many of the people we have spent the evening with, the work was only just beginning. The gong farmer preferred darkness. The night watchman welcomed it. The gravedigger sometimes worked by torchlight when necessity refused to respect daylight hours. Civilizations, it turns out, never truly slept. They simply handed responsibility from one group of invisible workers to another. The medieval night itself possessed a personality entirely different from our own. Today, if you wake at 2 in the morning, you can probably illuminate an entire room with the gentle glow of a phone screen. Streetlights stretch for miles. Cars pass outside. Refrigerators hum softly. Somewhere, someone is almost certainly ordering food they probably do not need. A medieval night offered none of those reassuring little sounds. Once darkness settled, it settled completely. Clouds erased moonlight. Candles remained expensive. Oil lamps burned carefully rationed fuel. Most households extinguished flames early because tomorrow required just as much light as today. The world became astonishingly quiet, and quiet, as every insomniac knows, has a remarkable talent for making tiny sounds feel enormous. A mouse inside the wall suddenly resembled something much larger. The creaking of timber became a mysterious visitor. Wind beneath a loose roof tile sounded suspiciously intelligent. For the workers whose professions carried them into this darkness, imagination often became another occupational hazard. The night watchman walked slowly through narrow streets carrying a lantern and perhaps a spear or staff. His job sounded wonderfully simple. Stay awake. Notice trouble. Raise the alarm. Simple instructions become considerably more complicated when surrounded by complete darkness, and every building seems determined to produce unexplained noises. Many towns expected watchmen to announce the passing hours aloud. They called into the darkness, not only to mark time, but also to reassure sleeping residents that someone remained awake. There is something strangely comforting about that. A sleepy voice echoing through silent streets, not announcing danger, simply reminding everyone that another hour had passed safely. Of course, watchmen occasionally found themselves investigating suspicious sounds. Now imagine doing that without electric lights, without radios, without backup, arriving in 3 minutes. A strange noise around the corner might reveal nothing more dangerous than a wandering pig. or an intoxicated merchant attempting serious negotiations with a rain barrel, or perhaps two cats engaged in what cats apparently consider perfectly reasonable conversation. History rarely records these encounters. Perhaps wisely, one suspects medieval archives already contained enough paperwork. Meanwhile, outside the town walls, the knacker occasionally continued working beneath moonlight. Removing a dead horse from a busy road could not always wait until morning. Travel continued. Merchants arrived late. Pilgrims departed early. Roads needed clearing. The stars overhead remained magnificent regardless of whatever unfortunate assignment happened to occupy the evening. That contrast feels strangely poetic. Infinite constellations stretching across the heavens, while one exhausted worker struggles to persuade a stubborn cartwheel through thick mud beside an equally stubborn mule. The universe has always displayed a subtle sense of humor. As centuries passed, these forgotten workers slowly shaped the development of medieval towns in ways few people recognized. Their labor influenced architecture, public health, trade, even laws. Take tanning, for example. As towns expanded, citizens increasingly complained about unbearable smells drifting from leather workshops. Eventually, authorities responded. Tanneries moved farther from residential districts, not because leather became less necessary, because successful communities gradually learned that breathing comfortably represented a worthwhile civic objective. Progress often begins with remarkably practical observations. Likewise, repeated outbreaks of disease encouraged stricter regulations surrounding waste disposal. Not perfect regulations, certainly not modern sanitation, but improvements, slowly, patiently, almost reluctantly. History seldom advances in dramatic leaps. More often it shuffles forward while muttering that perhaps the previous arrangement was becoming slightly inconvenient. Executioners, too, saw their roles evolve. Legal systems changed. Punishments varied. Some regions reduced public spectacles. Others increased bureaucracy. Yet the strange social isolation surrounding executioners persisted remarkably long. Even generations later, descendants sometimes inherited not only property, but also reputation. Imagine carrying a family name everyone immediately associated with duties performed decades earlier. It forgives kings more easily than neighbors. Throughout medieval Europe, guilds gradually organized many skilled professions. Carpenters, masons, weavers, goldsmiths, each established standards, apprenticeships, and mutual support. Some unpleasant occupations also developed professional traditions. Knowledge passed quietly from experienced workers to beginners. Not through famous universities, not inside magnificent libraries, but through conversation, observation, daily repetition. An older worker demonstrating the safest way to descend into a cesspit. A veteran tanner recognizing high-quality hides with one careful touch. A gravedigger understanding exactly how soil behaved after heavy rain. These lessons rarely entered history books, yet they represented genuine expertise. Perhaps one of the greatest misconceptions about medieval labor is the assumption that difficult work required little intelligence. Quite the opposite. Survival often depended upon careful judgment. Consider the gong farmer once again. He needed to recognize dangerous gases without scientific instruments, understand structural stability, calculate how much weight ropes could safely support, know where waste could legally be transported, negotiate payment, maintain equipment, avoid illness whenever possible. That sounds suspiciously like professional skill, merely one performed under deeply unfortunate aromatic circumstances. The same held true for tanners. Leather production demanded chemistry before chemistry possessed a name. Temperature mattered, timing mattered. One mistake ruined weeks of labor. Even butchers required anatomical knowledge, practical mathematics, business management, and impressive physical coordination. History occasionally disguises expertise beneath dirty clothing, perhaps because humans have always confused clean hands with important work. The irony, naturally, remains deliciously intact. Many wealthy nobles who considered themselves infinitely superior to these workers would have struggled to survive even a single week without them. Imagine asking a medieval lord to empty his own cesspit. One suspects diplomacy might suddenly become very popular. Or picture an aristocratic court attempting to manufacture its own leather boots. After approximately 3 hours, someone would almost certainly declare the process beneath their dignity. Yet by sunset, they would still expect polished footwear. Civilizations have always depended upon invisible specialists. We simply keep inventing new kinds. The faces change, the principle never does. Today, we rarely think about sewage engineers unless pipes stop working. We seldom appreciate sanitation workers until garbage collection pauses for several days. Electricians become fascinating precisely when the lights refuse to cooperate. The medieval world differed less than we sometimes imagine. Its invisible workforce simply labored with simpler tools under considerably harsher conditions. As the centuries slipped quietly past, many of these professions disappeared or transformed beyond recognition. Underground sewer systems replaced countless cesspits. Scientific medicine gradually reduced certain dangers. Industrial chemistry replaced ancient tanning methods. Municipal sanitation evolved. Technology accomplished what generations of exhausted workers had once managed entirely through muscle, patience, and stubborn determination. Yet, something quietly beautiful remains hidden beneath their stories. Every one of these forgotten people woke before dawn, believing their work mattered. Not because poets praised them, not because statues honored them. Simply because families depended upon them, neighbors relied upon them. Entire towns continued functioning because someone accepted responsibilities everyone else preferred not to discuss. Perhaps that deserves its own kind of quiet admiration, not the noisy admiration reserved for conquerors or kings, something gentler, the kind offered to ordinary people whose names disappear while their contributions remain woven invisibly into everyday life. History, after all, is not built solely by those who wear crowns. Quite often it is held together by those carrying buckets, shovels, ropes, lanterns, and tired smiles, hoping tomorrow's workload might, just for once, smell slightly better than today's. As our journey through medieval streets slowly comes to an end, it becomes surprisingly difficult to remember the names of most kings who ruled during a particular decade. History books spend hundreds of pages arguing over their battles, their marriages, their ambitions, and their endless determination to move colorful lines across maps. Yet tonight, perhaps the people who linger in your mind are not the monarchs at all. Perhaps you are thinking about the gong farmer carefully climbing into another cesspit beneath a moonlit sky, hoping the wooden ladder would remain loyal for one more evening. Perhaps you remember the tanner whose entire neighborhood recognized his arrival several minutes before they actually saw him. Perhaps the executioner who quietly carried out duties nobody else wanted while eating dinner alone, because even those who depended upon him preferred to keep their distance. Or maybe the gravedigger, patiently returning another family member to the earth, knowing tomorrow would almost certainly ask him to do exactly the same thing again. They were not glamorous. They were rarely celebrated. Almost no songs were written about them. Yet if they had all decided to take a week off simultaneously, medieval civilization would probably have discovered, in a remarkably unpleasant fashion, exactly how essential they truly were. That may be one of history's greatest little jokes. The people considered lowest often supported everyone standing above them. Civilizations like to imagine themselves resting upon glorious ideas, magnificent rulers, and heroic victories. In reality, they usually rest upon thousands of ordinary people, completing extraordinarily unpleasant jobs before breakfast. The longer we look into the medieval world, the more familiar it quietly becomes. The tools have changed. The smells have certainly improved in many places, which feels like genuine progress. Our cities glow with electric lights instead of smoky lanterns. Waste disappears through underground pipes instead of waiting for someone with a bucket and exceptional courage. Leather emerges from distant factories rather than riverside workshops filled with vats whose ingredients are probably best left unlisted before bedtime. And yet the pattern remains comfortingly similar. Every modern city still depends upon countless workers whose names we rarely know. People repairing water mains before dawn. Sanitation crews collecting rubbish, while most neighborhoods are still asleep. Maintenance teams inspecting bridges. Hospital cleaners preparing operating rooms. Electricians restoring power during storms. Delivery drivers crossing cities before sunrise. We notice them most clearly only when they are suddenly absent. History has always excelled at teaching this gentle lesson. Invisible work is often the work holding everything together. There is something strangely peaceful about that realization. Not because difficult labor is romantic, It usually is not, but because every generation, no matter how complicated its problems appear, quietly produces ordinary people willing to solve them. Someone always carries the bucket. Someone always lights the fire. Someone always clears the road. Someone always cleanses the place everyone else hopes never to think about. Perhaps humanity survives less because of extraordinary heroes, and because millions of fairly ordinary people simply wake up each morning and get on with whatever uncomfortable task needs doing. It is a quieter kind of courage, the sort history often whispers instead of shouting. And now, if you imagine those medieval towns one last time, notice how peaceful they become after everyone has gone home. The marketplace stands empty. The forge has cooled. The tannery is silent. The executioner's yard is still. Even the cemetery rests beneath soft moonlight. The smells that once filled the air have long since drifted away. The voices have faded. The arguments have ended. The endless labor that occupied every hour of every day has dissolved into centuries of silence. Grass grows where workshops once stood. Wildflowers bloom beside forgotten roads. Stone walls soften beneath moss. Ancient wooden buildings have long since returned to the forests from which they came. The people themselves, from the richest noble to the humblest gong farmer, now share the same quiet place in history. Time, it seems, is wonderfully democratic. It eventually grants everyone the same deep rest. And perhaps there is comfort in knowing that the worries weighing upon your own shoulders tonight, however heavy they may feel, belong to the same long human story. People have always carried responsibilities. They have always wondered whether tomorrow's work would be harder than today's. They have always worried about family, money, health, and the uncertain future waiting just beyond sunrise. For thousands of years, those worries have arrived, stayed for a while, and eventually faded into memory. Yours will too. So let your shoulders sink just a little lower. Let your jaw soften. Allow your breathing to become slow and effortless. The medieval town has gone quiet now. Its lanterns have burned low. Its workers have finally found their rest. Only the stars remain above the rooftops, shining exactly as they did centuries ago, patient witnesses to every strange profession, every ridiculous law, every difficult day, and every ordinary life that quietly helped keep the world turning. Thank you for spending this peaceful journey through one of history's dirtiest, strangest, and most surprisingly human corners. Now, there is nothing left to investigate, nothing left to clean, nothing left to carry. Only the calm rhythm of the night, the steady passing of time, and the gentle certainty that, unlike the poor medieval gong farmer, tomorrow morning you almost certainly will not be climbing into a cesspit before breakfast. And considering everything we have learned tonight, that is a wonderfully comforting thought to fall asleep with.